It's been almost 6 months since the RX 9070 XT released. Let's go ahead and see how it's doing in this long overdue review.
This cheapskate is still using unactivated Windows? Doesn't he know about keyspan? Let me grab my glasses. Oh my god, he is. Hey. If you use Keyspan, you can get 50% off Windows licenses using BEZ50 and 62% off Microsoft Office licenses using BEZ62. It's easy to pay like I'm doing right now, and you can pay through PayPal. Don't be a stupid human, like my friend, and have unactivated Windows. Check keyspan.com, linked in the comments and the description below.
The RX 9070 XT that we will be using for this review is the ASRock Taichi OC model. This guy is RDNA 4 of course, has a base clock of 1870 MHz and a boost clock of 3100 MHz. It's operating on PCIe 5.0 16X, has 16GB of GDDR6 memory on a 256-bit bus. This guy has a triple slot design, so it's pretty big, with 1 HDMI and 3 display ports. It also takes the 16X connector. Its TDP is 304 watts and the release date was March 6, 2025. So it's a little bit earlier this year. Our system specs are pretty simple. We'll be using a stock Ryzen 7 7800 X3D with PBO on. We have the Arctic Liquid Freezer 3 on top of that. Of course, the ASRock RX 9070 XT Taichi OC will be stock for this video, and I won't be changing the base or boost clock numbers. So it'll be the same one that comes with this particular card. We have 32GB of G.Skill DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, an ASRock X870E Taichi Lite, and everything will be done on Windows 10 with the latest AMD drivers being 25.8.1. Let's head over to the benchmarks. Starting us off, we have Alan Wake 2 on high setting. We can see at 1080p we achieved an average FPS of 123 and a 1% low of 87. 1440p was more than playable of course, at 88 FPS on average and 66 for 1% lows. On 4K we took a bit of a hit here and it didn't feel as nice. We were on 48 FPS for average and 34 for 1% lows. A good performance overall, but a little bit lacking at 4K. Next up we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6 on extreme settings using the in-game benchmark. At 1080p we had an average FPS of 184 but a 1% low of 80. It did feel like there was a little bit of stutter at some places. Interestingly, at 1440p we had a slightly better 1% low of 90 and the average FPS was 136. At 4K it was still a good experience with the average FPS being 79 and the 1% lows being 36. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 is always a little bit of a harder benchmark. Even on the RX 9070 XT we can see on 1080p we only achieve an average FPS of 77 and a 1% low of 67. This is a 27% decrease to 56 FPS at 1440p, and yet another big decrease by 43% to 32 FPS at 4K. I did find at 1440p was probably the highest resolution I'd use with the Epic settings, and 4K just didn't feel as nice due to the lower frame rate. Next up we have Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty with high settings. I'm pleased to say at 1080p we achieved an average FPS of 168 and a 1% low of 104. Compare that to 1440p, we go down to 126 for average FPS and 81 for 1% lows. At 4K we still remain more than playable at 70 FPS for average FPS and 48 for 1% lows. The game is still pretty demanding, and we'll see more of Cyberpunk in the ray trace testing results. Next up is F124 on ultra high settings. As you can see, the RX 9070 XT can more than handle F124, pushing more than 100 FPS on 1080p, 1440p and 4K. At 4K was 117 FPS for average FPS and 97 for the 1% lows. I'm glad we had a really good result with F124. On Fortnite DX12 with medium settings on TSR Epic, we had a pretty competitive experience. What I mean by that is at 1080p we achieved an average FPS of 308 and a 1% low of 194. On 1440p we went down to 219 and a 1% low of 153. Even at 4K we have a more than playable experience at 115 FPS on average and the 1% low is 91 FPS. Really great results here, and we're only looking at a 48% drop from 1080p to 4K, and the 1% lows are pretty good across all three resolutions. Next up we have Hogwarts Legacy on ultra settings with TAA high. Hogwarts Legacy had an interesting result here with 140 FPS for 1080p on average and only 48 for the 1% lows. I did experience some stutter while playing the game, so I might have to do some retesting in the future. At 1440p we had an average FPS of 129 and a 1% low of 44, and going to 4K reduced our FPS by 34% on average to 85 FPS, and again that low 1% lows of 39. It felt okay, but it could be smoother, and I definitely need to look into this title. Next up we have Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered with the in-game benchmark. Horizon runs really well across the three resolutions, and of course with the 16GB of VRAM we don't have any issues. At 1080p we get 178 FPS on average and 116 for 1% lows. At 4K we still are at 101 FPS on average and 77 for 1% lows. The game looks beautiful, and over 100 FPS at 4K is a pretty good experience. Marvel Rivals pushes a pretty good number at 1080p, 174 FPS on average and 126 for 1% lows. This drops down to 135 at 1440p for average FPS and 100 FPS for 1% lows at 1440p. Even at 4K, we still are getting a decently playable experience with 78 FPS for average FPS and 54 for 1% lows. Marvel Rivals is of course a competitive game, but it's good to see that with these higher texture qualities, we are able to achieve a pretty smooth experience. Next up, we have Stalker 2. On Epic settings, TSR 100%. We can see at 1080p, we achieved an average FPS of 70, but a low 1% lows of 34. The 1% lows is again very similar at 1440p at 34 and 4K at 30. At 4K, this game doesn't feel that nice to play and feels a bit choppy in my opinion. Last but not least, The Last of Us Part 1 on ultra settings. At 1080p, we had a more than playable experience at 135 FPS on average, 113 for 1% lows. At 1440p, it dropped down to 104 FPS for average FPS, and 1% lows was at 91. On 4K, it still felt really playable at 62 FPS for average, and 1% lows was 55. Great result from The Last of Us Part 1. Having a look at all 11 games at 1080p, we find that our highest result here was from Fortnite on DX12 with 308 FPS on average and 194 for 1% lows. Our lowest result here was from Stalker 2 on 70 FPS for average FPS and 34 for 1% lows. It was great to see as well Marvel Rivals having a really good result at 174 despite having the higher graphics setting. Heading on to 1440p, we find again that Fortnite has the highest result again, but our lowest one is by Clair, Obscur, Expedition 33, and following not far behind is Stalker 2. For those two games, on their graphics settings, 1440p is the max I would take them. At 4K, we have a pretty similar story again. Fortnite and F124 perform really well. Marvel Rivals is pretty good as well, in the middle of the pack. Then our bottom three are Alan Wake 2, Stalker 2, and Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Not too bad a result though overall. And this is just a quick summary of the 11 games average FPS and average 1% lows FPS. Next up, we have our ray trace titles. All of our ray trace games will be benchmarked at 1440p on a 3-run average. First up, we have Alan Wake 2 with ray trace high settings. For average FPS, we achieved 33, and for our 1% lows, we achieved 22. Not too great a result here, and honestly didn't feel that great to play with the ray tracing on due to the low frame rate. Next up, we have Black Myth Wukong, the benchmark tool, with ray trace very high settings and quality upscaling. On average FPS, we achieved 43, and for 1% lows, we achieved 33. Not too great a result here that we achieved for Black Myth Wukong in the benchmark tool, and didn't feel too smooth, to be honest with you guys. Cyberpunk 2077, Phantom Liberty, we had our ray tracing on Ultra and FSR 3 quality upscaling. For the average FPS, we achieved 76, and for the 1% lows, we achieved 41. The game definitely looked pretty good with the ray tracing on, with being a relatively smooth experience. Lastly, we have Marvel Spiderman Remastered, ray tracing on very high, FSR 3 quality upscaling, with objects with no frame generation. Our average FPS was 108 and our 1% lows was 74. The game played really smoothly and I didn't really have any problems with this title in terms of ray tracing. Next up, we have our productivity benchmarks. First up, we have Blender. With Blender, I've used all the scenes and a higher score is better. We're using a 3-run average here, and our score was 3143 for the RX 9070 XT. Next up, we have ComfyUI with Zluda for image generation. I timed this in seconds, so the lower is better. I did 3 image generations using this prompt and 3 different seeds. Over the 3-run average, we got a time of 57 seconds. Next up, we have Handbrake, compressing a video from 4K to 1080p on MP4 on these settings. I did a 3-run average again, and our time in seconds was 11, so not too bad at all for the video compression. Lastly, we have Waifu 2X Video Upscaler. So this is taking a video from 1080p to 4K. I use these settings for the upscaler. The upscaler took 104 minutes to complete, which is 1 hour and 44 minutes. I can't comment too much on these productivity benchmarks, but I hope this provides some insight if you use these tools. We have some power draw numbers in wattage for the RX 9070 XT Taichi OC. Both of these games were run at 1440p on just a 1-run average. All of the wattage numbers were measured through a smart meter. So what I did is I took the idle system wattage for 10 minutes and averaged it out. This means I was just on the desktop of my computer with literally nothing happening on the screen. That 10-minute idle wattage is 142 watts. Now the smart meter of course measures the total wattage, so what I did is I took the total wattage and minused off the idle wattage. So as we can see, on The Last of Us Part 1 we got 394 watts, and for Warhammer 40k on Ultra we got 397 watts. Now of course this won't be 100% accurate as I don't have fancy equipment to test this, but this is what I managed to get in terms of wattage for my RX 9070 XT Taichi OC. Having a look at current pricing for the RX 9070 XT, we can see the pricing is okay. So what I paid for my RX 9070 XT Taichi OC was $871 which is quite a bit. The current price for that same card in New Zealand at the moment is $844, so that's a $27 difference. Keep in mind that that same card in New Zealand is on a special discounted price at the moment. The next two we have are the 5 cheapest cards from New Zealand and the 5 cheapest cards from Newegg. Just keep in mind that a couple of these cards from New Zealand were on a special discounted price as well. For the New Zealand retailer pricing, we have $822 across the 5 cards, and with the Newegg pricing we have $710. So you guys in the US are a lot luckier than we are in New Zealand. That's quite a significant difference of $112. The RX 9070 XT is still quite expensive, and it really depends on what region you're in. For example, in Australia I have seen the 5070 Ti being the same price price, if not cheaper, than the RX 9070 XT. Let's head over to cost per frame in US dollars. This is based on the Raster results for the 11 game average, so no ray tracing results here. And this is just for average FPS, not for 1% lows. We have 1080p, 1440p, and 4K. We can see that the result for 1080p of course is the best, being $4.45 for the Newegg listings. The New Zealand pricing has us at $6.56 overall for the 5 average listings at 1440p. The Tai Chi OC for New Zealand at 1440p doesn't fall too far behind at $6.72. Of course, at 4K we're going to get the most cost per frame at $9.48 for the Newegg pricing, $10.98 for the New Zealand 5 average pricing, and $11.25 for the New Zealand pricing on the Tai Chi OC. Having a look at GPU temperature, we're using Warframe on a survival map called Mott. We're using ludicrous settings and at 4K. The total runtime was 30 minutes. The room temperature was between 24 to 25 degrees Celsius, and I had the side panel on my Corsair 5000D. So on our RX 9070 XT Tai Chi OC, we did get pretty warm, with our average GPU temperature being 63 degrees Celsius and our memory temperature being quite high at 96 degrees. Warframe is pretty intensive, so this does make sense, especially at 4K. Our GPU hotspot was 89 degrees Celsius, and we had our GPU fan speed on average for around about 1509 RPM. Our core clock speed was a little bit lower than it should have been at about 2805 MHz, but our memory clock is about correct at 2505 MHz. The card did get pretty hot from this test. The RX 9070 XT has performed pretty well across the 3 resolutions, and I'm honestly pretty happy that I picked it up for my main rig. At 4K, it averaged around about 75 FPS across the 11 game benchmark, with 1% low sitting at around about 53. That's a really solid performance for native 4K gaming, especially without relying heavily on upscaling. When you drop it down to 1440p, things get even smoother, averaging 125 FPS, with 85 FPS for 1% lows, which is right there where you want it for high refresh gaming. And at 1080p, it just flies along, 160 FPS on average, and 103 for 1% lows across those 11 games. So performance-wise, across all 3 resolutions in raster performance, it's been really consistent and pretty strong. Now when it comes to its value, that's where things get a little bit tricky. And honestly, it really depends on your region. Here in New Zealand, it's hard to find an RTX 5070 Ti anywhere near the RX 9070 XT's pricing. Even the lower end 9070 XT models are priced higher here than what you'd pay overseas. But for example, just across the ditch in Australia, I've already seen listings where the 5070 Ti is actually cheaper than the lowest end RX 9070 XTs. From what I've seen as well, most regions don't have the original MSRP cards of $600 anymore, and most likely won't for a long time. In New Zealand, I have seen almost all models rise in price from the launch date, which is a bit concerning. But then again, like I mentioned before, in Australia, the price is already falling a little bit. Cost per frame is where you really see the regional differences bite a bit. If you got your RX 9070 XT from Newegg in the US, you're paying around about $5.66 per frame at 1440p. My pricing in New Zealand pushed that up to $6.72 US, and if we look at the 4K cost per frame, it hits $11.24. So yeah, definitely not cheap. And if you're gaming at 4K, the value becomes a little bit harder to justify unless you're locked into the AMD ecosystem, or you can't get the Nvidia alternative for a cheaper price. If the RX 9070 XT and the 5070 Ti were the same price, or the 5070 Ti was cheaper, I would probably go with the 5070 Ti instead of the RX 9070 XT. And I'll expand a little bit on this now. There are a lot of AI tools, whether it's ComfyUI with stable diffusion, or upscaling stuff like Waifu2X, that still lean on Nvidia's CUDA cores. Yes, I did get Zluda working on my RX 9070 XT, and it worked. ComfyUI generated an image in around about 57 seconds, so it's not unusable by any means, but I did have to take a little bit to tinker with it. That's the kind of thing you don't have to fully deal with on an RTX card. It just works out of the box for these AI tools. So if you're a creator or a person doing heavy AI workflows, that's something to keep in mind. That said, for gaming, the RTX 9070 XT didn't disappoint me, at least in my opinion. It handled ray tracing better than expected. In Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty, with FSR 3.0, quality, and ray tracing ultra, it managed to get 76 FPS at 1440p. In Marvel Rivals Spiderman Remastered, with ray tracing very high, FSR 3, it still pushed 108 FPS, which is honestly pretty good. Alan Wake 2 is still a bit rough though, only hitting 33 FPS at 1440p with ray trace high, but the game's brutal on pretty much everything, so it wasn't that much of a surprise. On the productivity side, I ran a few other workloads just to get a better picture of everything. Handbrake was fast with encoding a 4K file down to 1080p in just 11 seconds. Waifu2x Upscaling had a 1080p video go to 4K in around about 104 minutes, so not completely unrealistic for this workload. The thermals and the power draw have been alright for my RX 9070 XT Taichi OC, not the best, and during a 30-minute run of Warframe at a stress test for 4K, the core set around about 63 degrees Celsius, with the memory peaking around about 96 degrees Celsius, and the GPU hotspot around about 89 degrees Celsius. So a bit hot, but at the same time, Warframe is pretty intensive, so not the best result overall. So overall, despite the pricing being a bit rough here in New Zealand, the RX 9070 XT has been a rock solid daily driver for me. Switching from Nvidia after 5 years, I really haven't missed much, in my opinion, and gaming performance is strong, feature support is pretty solid with FSR 4, and with a bit of extra work, even with AI, it's possible to manage some workflows. If you're gaming at 1440p or 4K and want a powerful card without breaking into the top tier flagship pricing, the RX 9070 XT can be worth it. Just take a serious look to make sure that your local pricing is decent before pulling the trigger. That about sums up the video. Check out whystech.org for some more awesome content. But other than that, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!